So they told us that Eve was the reason we fell, that she was deceived, she was disobedient, cursed all women forever. But what if Eve was not the villain? What if she was never the villain? What if the garden wasn't just a paradise, but it was a setup? What if her so-called sin was actually spiritually awakening? Let's talk about what religion taught us. Eve was blamed for everything: the fall of man, the origin of sin, the reason women suffer in childbirth, the justification for women's silence, their submission, and their shame. They told us that she brought evil into the world just because she was too curious. But that's not what the Bible actually says. That's what interpretation says. That's what centuries of control says. That's what patriarchy needed to be true to keep the power where it wanted it. Let's break that wide open. Let's look at the text. Genesis 3:6 tells us Adam was with her. He ate the fruit too and said nothing. But only Eve is ever called the problem. Why? She asked the question, she reached for understanding, she acted. Adam stood behind her and followed passively, but it was her voice that got demonized. And the serpent? It's never once called Satan in the original Hebrew. In ancient cultures, serpents symbolized wisdom, healing, and transformation. Even in the Bible, God used a bronze serpent to heal people in the wilderness. Check out Numbers 21. What if the serpent wasn't tempting Eve to sin, but inviting her to awaken? God said, "You will surely die," but they didn't die immediately. They became aware. Genesis 3:22 says, "Now they've become like us, knowing good and evil." Isn't that what religion feared all along? That we'd remember that we're divine, that we'd awaken to our own power, that we would stop following blindly and start discerning deeply? God never even cursed Eve. Read it closely. The serpent was cursed. The ground was cursed. Even Adam, they received consequences, but not curses. Pain in childbirth wasn't a punishment, it's an earthbound process. And even in that pain, Eve was still chosen to birth life. The church used her pain to preach shame, but God used her pain to reveal power. We were taught that Eve was punished, but look at what God does after the awareness. He clothes them. He covers them. That's not a God who's casting Eve away. That's a God who knows she stepped into something sacred and too heavy to carry naked. What if the consequences weren't about punishment, but they were about protection? Eve's story doesn't end with exile. It continues with creation. She is the first woman to speak life after loss. She names Cain. She speaks with God's help. She becomes the mother of all living. She was called to birth life through pain and still praised God. That's not a woman to be demonized. That's a prophetess, a priestess, a portal. Eve was not banished from God. She birthed the nation under his covering. But why don't they teach us that? Because the story of a spiritually gifted, God-connected woman who questioned authority, held divine wisdom, and still heard from God, well, that would dismantle everything religious control was built on. Eve's very existence challenges religious control. Eve was the first seeker, the first woman to ask, to reach, and to taste divine mystery. She was not a failure. She was a mirror. The church made her story about disobedience, but her story is actually about discernment. We were never meant to fear Eve. We were meant to remember her, to reclaim her, and in doing so, reclaim ourselves. Because if Eve was never the villain, maybe you aren't either. You don't have to carry the shame that they put on her. You don't have to apologize for your curiosity, for your voice, or for your calling. You're not the fall. You're the fruit. Download the Rebirth workbook and reflect deeper. Rewrite your Eve story and step into your own garden moment.